Well, many thanks for the invitation to be on this panel. I'm here in a capacity of just representing myself, not any institution. But I guess I was invited because I have blogged over many years on things like research evaluation, and I have particular views on the use of grant income as a way of evaluating researchers, which I'll briefly tell you about now. I can see the attraction of using grant income, which many institutions do, in the sense that it's objective and it's also, of course, relevant for academics. But what I'm going to do is to argue that there are 6 reasons why, in practice, it's very bad and not fair and has unintended consequences. The first reason it's, I think, not a good proxy is that these days, in the 21st century, in most academic disciplines, research is done by teams rather than by a lone genius. In the past, it may have been true that great discoveries were made by a single individual, perhaps with a research assistant. But these days, most research will be done by groups of people who will have different sorts of skills, all of which are necessary to the research, but not all of which involve getting grants. So you may need people to do all sorts of different things, such as coding or to have technical skills and so on. And those people are just as necessary for research to be successful as the person who writes the grant. And so if you pluck out the people who are not getting grants and discard them, you could actually end up with a research group that is thoroughly dysfunctional. So you need to be thinking about the bigger picture than the individual researcher. The same sort of argument applies at a broader level to whole departments. So departments typically need to have people who can do teaching, who can do outreach, who can do things like the Athena Swan application, which is a huge amount of work, as much work as writing a grant proposal. And these are just some examples of things that need to be done. And somehow universities try and maintain the myth that everybody can be wonderful at all these things. That's just ridiculous. In practice, some people are better at some things than others, and you need this balance of roles and skills in university departments with people finding their niche in which they can thrive. So again, if you have a department that is all focused on one thing, you can end up very unbalanced and with some areas not adequately covered. The third reason comes very much from my observations serving on grant panels, and that is that chance plays a large role in grant success. It's well known that there's very poor agreement between different people rating grants, and this is perhaps not surprising because there's so many a grant is really a fairly multidimensional thing. It can be good and bad in so many different ways. There's so many different aspects. Some people value some things more than others. And typically you're comparing grants that may be in quite different subject areas. So it can be quite hard to really compare these apples and oranges with one another. And certainly my experience is that most funders will have a large number of entirely fundable grants between which they have to choose, and there can be a degree of arbitrariness at the end of the day in terms of who gets funded. And it may just depend on who happens to be on the grant panel, who happens to be asked to review that grant, and just the luck of the draw. So if you're treating grant success as an evidence of academic excellence, you're really measuring people not just on how good they are, but also on how lucky they are. And that is likely to be pretty demoralising for people and not a very fair way of evaluating people. In addition, grant income is an input measure. It's how much you get income to do research. But what about bang for your buck? Are we going to say that we don't value somebody who actually generates a lot of good research without requiring a lot of financial resources? That would actually mean that a lot of people who historically have been regarded as very good researchers or even Nobel laureates might not be fundable in the current system. And indeed, Nobel laureates of the past are fond of telling people that. They would not have survived the REF, for example. So you really need to think more about what are people doing with the resources they get, rather than just treating the getting of resources as an end in itself. The focus on grant income can also encourage what I call grant hoarding. You get these people who can be like captains of industry in an academic sort of way, and get grant after grant, and the bigger the better. And I think we've probably all seen examples of that, and I think it's not healthy. In part because for a grant to be really successful, it needs concentrated attention from people with skills and experience doing the research. And I've certainly come across early career researchers who complain that the PI is never there because they're so busy doing too many different things. They really haven't got much of an idea of what's going on because they've delegated everything. And I think that's actually something that hasn't been looked at hard enough, how far you can actually have too much grant income. I mean, that for many university administrators, that would seem a joke to say that you can have too much. But I would argue it has a corrosive effect on research. It dilutes the quality of research, and it can end up meaning that there's not enough money to go around, but the money that there is not being used wisely, and so there's a lot of waste. Finally, the psychological element. Academics need mental space to do good research. If you keep them anxious because they keep thinking that if they don't get the next grant they might be out of a job, this takes up a lot of mental space. You really need to have a sense of relaxation, an ability to concentrate and not think about anything else to do excellent work. And so if you want to foster your researchers, you really want to take some of these pressures off them rather than continually making them feel that they're under threat and that everything is very short term and in the next round they might be gone for not getting that grant. It actually will damage their productivity on any grant that they've currently got if they're worrying about these sorts of things. Now, having said all that, I have some sympathy for university administrators who have to always, the phrase that's always used is we have to make difficult decisions, but they do. We live in the real world. Things don't stand still, so we can't just keep everything going as it always has done. There may be things that do need to change. There may at times be redundancies need to be made if there's just, the institution has to make ends meet in difficult times with a lot of external pressures. So decisions have to be made. We can't just say, oh, this is a bad criterion and therefore let's get rid of it. You have to put something in its place. Fortunately, I don't have to be responsible for telling you about that because there's other speakers in this session who are going to have many positive suggestions for alternative and much less destructive approaches to evaluation. And in particular, I'm aware of the Leiden Manifesto and the Hong Kong Principles, to name just two. But the bottom line for institutions, I would argue, is that people who run institutions should be asking themselves, suppose the Times Higher, instead of focusing on rankings for grant income, rankings for publications, rankings for student satisfaction, had rankings for staff satisfaction. What would your institution look like if that was the case? If the answer is that you'd do badly, then you're really not making good use of your most precious resource, which is your staff. Because without your staff, you really can't function, and you want happy, contented staff who will then repay you in full if they feel valued and fostered. What you are doing is creating incentives for poor quality research. As I've already said, I think you're really making people feel that they have to continually be putting in grant proposals rather than taking time to focus on perhaps one aspect of research very carefully. But you're not just damaging research and your staff, you're also damaging yourself because you're damaging your reputation once it gets out that people are very unhappy in your institution and that you're adopting rather arbitrary and unfair criteria for evaluating people. And that's going to deter excellent staff from coming to work at your institution. So you're really going to get into a negative spiral if you're not careful. And therefore my advice is very strongly, let's get rid of grant income as a means of evaluating people. But to hear about other things we might do, I will stop now and allow you to hear the other speakers.